It's a real pleasure for me to host Marcel here. He lives most of the year in France, although in his life he's lived in France, Germany, and America, where he went to high school, amongst other things. College, went to Occidental College, right?
Sorry?
You went to Occidental College?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so
not at the same time as President Obama.
Different.
Little earlier. Little earlier.
And so in today's, in the 2 hours we have today, I have a few clips that I've pulled from some of Marcel's films as kind of touch points for us to think about some of what makes his films extraordinary to me. And I want to spend some of today putting those films in perspective into the context of the times that they were made. And I also want to spend some time trying to take away some lessons from the several decades of filmmaking that you put in. And along the way, maybe halfway into this, I'll encourage the people in the room to raise their hands and ask questions, and we can make this more of a dialogue midway through. What brings Marcel here this week is the extraordinary restoration of his film Memory of Justice. So, the films that are probably best known of Marcel's are Sorrow and the Pity from 1971, I think, and then the second really major work after that was Memory of Justice in 1976. There was other work in between, but I think that is a real standout. And then the third one that I think has had the most prominence in the US is Hotel Terminus, which came out in the late 1980s and went on to win an Academy Award. And in some ways, like, those three films can be seen as a kind of trilogy, although I don't think they ever certainly wasn't intentional from the get-go to do that. So let me start with Sorrow and the Pity. Sorrow and the Pity you made after you had made a couple fiction films, following in the footsteps of your father, Max Ophuls. No?
I know.
Already the contrariness arises.
I don't really want to contradict you directly, but the idea of my father's feet were too big for me to even get the idea that I could be in his footsteps.
It was a family profession.
That's why
Fair.
I said no. With feet this big, you can't follow in footsteps this big.
So you had you'd made a couple fiction films in France. The second one, in your own words, was
bad. If we talk about that, actually, thanks to François Truffaut and the friendship of François Truffaut, the first thing I did was a sketch, the German sketch as it happened, to a film called Love at 20. That wasn't bad. It was okay, I think. The best sketch was his, not the other 3 or 4. Antoine Nicolette is wonderful. But then I got the opportunity to make a film with, again, through the friendship with Truffaut, I got to know Jean Moreau, and we did a comedy that was successful, was not so much. I'm not a member of the New Wave, I never was. For one thing, I'm already too old for that. I was already a bit old to be a member of the New Wave. But it wasn't so much a director's film, it was actors. It was a comedy, actors. And it was successful. And after that, we had the plan of doing another Belmondo Moreau film, and they were off. Jean was off filming with Orson Welles, and I went, and we got them. There weren't enough. Again, it was a matter of groceries, as it so often is, and so I took on a film that where the director was sick, and I took it on, and was a film with Eddie Constantine that I did for, and that was indeed a very bad film. And so I didn't find any work.
Closed doors for you in fiction, and so
I went into documentary, not really right away in documentaries, but into journalism on French television. And out of the 3 years of work, was about 3 years, I learned, or I hope I learned, about journalism. So when the time came when that crew working in television was offered the opportunity of doing contemporary history programs, I was the one who was assigned to do them. And so it was first before the Serendipity. They were 2 evenings. You know, there's a lot of talk, why are the films long and so forth. Well, because the original commission was not for a long film in one evening, it was separate evenings. And the first one was about the Munich Agreement, 1938. And that was successful. And so we just did the follow-up, which turned out to be the Serendipity. Except that in between time, I don't want to give a lot of autobiography here, but in between time, there had been 1968. And André Harris and Alain de Sédoué, who were my bosses in television, and André Harris is the co-author of the Serendipity because we did the interviews together. We were among the strike leaders.
So
against the French monopoly.
For young people in the audience, just to contextualize this is 1968 in Paris. There's student uprisings, they closed the universities.
We were among the strikers. As a matter of fact, we must have been prominent strikers since we were the only ones that were fired. So that seems to lead to the conclusion that we must have been rather active. And so then I went to work for German television, and after a while, I thought, well, let's just take up that project since we had prepared it and found all the locations and people, and so then.
So Serendipity winds up really originating out of German TV.
Yes. Which
even though we think of it as such a French film.
Keep a secret for quite a while because in the French climate of that period, it wouldn't have been a terribly popular thing to admit that we were also mostly financed by German television.
So Serendipity, it's being made roughly 25 years after the end of World War II.
Yes.
And the message that Serendipity is delivering in broad strokes is that France during the war was not, everyone was not a resistance fighter. There was a lot of gray area in the world of collaboration. And in fact, even some of the resistance fighters had a complicated experience.
Like François Mitterrand. This is an example of that. Yes. That were on one side at the beginning and then shifted side as the war shifted side, perhaps. But Tom, if some things are, I think, in current affairs and in politics and in history occur at a certain time. If we hadn't done it, somebody else would have done it sooner or later, because at that time, the Gaullist communist idea that indeed the whole country had resisted the invader it wasn't tenable anymore. Tenable? Is that a word?
Yeah, tenable.
Tenable anymore. The time had come for that, just as 1968 happened not by accident. That film, and also the book that Robert Paxton wrote at that time, which we didn't even know because it was simultaneously, La France de Vichy. It had to happen.
These ideas are bubbling
the
up.
Gaullist myths had become totally unrealistic and no longer believable.
So you made this 4-hour film with German TV money, and then
not only, also
with other,
yeah.
And then when it comes time to try to air it on French television, you hit a roadblock.
Yes, absolutely. And that became a scandal in itself. The fact that French television, who had originally given us the film to make, didn't want to do it. There's perhaps an anecdote in connection with that. By that time, de Gaulle was no longer president of the Fifth Republic. He had just recently retired. And the Director General of French TV went to see him to talk about the film, and said to about that they were offered to buy this documentary about the occupation of France. And the general asked him, well, what's in the film? And the Director General said, I wasn't there, but there are witnesses, said some disagreeable truths, mon général. And the general answered, the French don't need truth, they need hope. Which I think is a beautiful thing. But let's just say that General de Gaulle and I didn't have the same job. It's a different job.
Yours is the job to tell the truth.
Not the same job as being a leader in politics.
So, blocked from French TV, you with Francois Truffaut's help, take the film into movie theaters.
Yes. Again, in large part thanks to Francois Truffaut. There was also a board of censors my God, when you think back on it, Gaullist France was full of censorship. I mean, Paths of Glory, Stanley Kubrick's film, was banned from France for some 15 years. But then it wasn't as big a deal for Stanley Kubrick as it was for us being banned. He didn't have all that much at stake. I mean, Paths of Glory is a magnificent film. Anyway, so it had, yes, there's also a censorship board for films at that time. And Truffaut wanted the film to come out, and he appointed 2 colleagues of his in the Cahiers du Cinéma, one very far left, a communist, and another one pretty far right, to the right, so they would shove the obstacles aside. And again, the Emmanuelle Roy, the woman who prepared for that screening.
She was someone who worked with Truffaut. She worked with Truffaut.
Yes.
Yeah.
She was with the Cahiers du Cinéma at the time. And she mixed up the reels on purpose so that the people looking at it would think, well, this is something for intellectual, it can do no harm. And really. And that, of course, helped them
So it got
get
approved to be shown in a French cinema.
Yes, where it played for 18 months. At first on the left bank in a small theater, and then the other theaters got bigger, and then it played on the Champs-Élysées, and it was extremely successful. But it took another 12 years for the film to be shown on television. And in fact, it was when the socialists, when Mitterrand came to power, they had promised in advance to journalists that the serendipity would be shown because it was that big an issue in France. The journalists were constantly asking the heads of state and the people in charge, the prime minister, when are you going to put it on television? And they had promised to put it on television. I happen to know that Mitterrand didn't like the film at all, but there are at least two promises that he kept. One, which seems to me to be the more important one, is the abolition of capital punishment. And the other one is the serendipity. Kept at least those two promises. Okay, well, that's the story.
Yeah. So I know in this room there's probably a range of people who have seen some of Marcel's work or haven't. How many people have seen Sorrow and the Pity in the room? And you're not being judged or counted. Okay. Well, I want to show a clip from Sorrow and the Pity, especially for those of you who haven't seen it. This is a clip from the second half of the film where you are interviewing some former resistance fighters, known as the Grave brothers, Alexis and Louis Grave. And so it's about a 3-minute clip, and Christian, if you want to. So there's a few things that I want to ask about in that clip. One is, you've described to me that one of your pleasures of making documentary films, and I think one thing that you have a special skill at, is being able to interview people from the very top of status and hierarchy to
society.
Yeah, to lowest, and you get this range. And I mean, I wonder if you can just start by telling us, the background to doing that interview with the
Grave brothers.
Yeah, with the Grave brothers.
Oh, when we had decided on the town, the next job was to go to the local newspaper. It's mostly through the newspaper, La Montagne, which during the occupation was Pierre Laval's newspaper, that we got names and went to meet people, find out, and then put them in the film or not. The source of where to find them, as far as Clermont-Ferrand is concerned,
The town that you focus on.
Yes, the town that was chosen for several reasons. Yes, and to a great extent that was André Harris who had the relationship, two people on that news.
Your producer on the project.
Well, producer and co-author. I mean, the interview, the clip you just showed, all the questions, I haven't seen the film. All the questions are André.
It's André, yes.
Yeah. Which is not always the case. I mean, you asked me that before in the green room. Whoever seemed to have the closer connection or found the people, we would just, sometimes he did, sometimes I did, and sometimes we both did. In this case, we both did, but this particular part of the interview is, he's the one who asked the question. And yes, to the question of how we found them, there is always a matter of scouting and looking for people who might be, and of course that's a whole job in itself. And I've never attempted to do it all by myself because different places, different stories call for different techniques of approach and of finding the people you need.
Something else that strikes me about that scene is that it has this wonderful casual feel. You know, there's wine bottles on the table,
Indeed,
people are chiming in, people are walking in the door, and many times documentary filmmakers are trying to control their interview, right? Or, you know,
trying to
shut the door, close it, make sure no one comes in. Yeah.
More respectable. Yes. Well, that reminds me of the fact that, again, it still is a controversial film in France. And one of the people who hates the film so much that in the short memoirs she has written, a remarkable person for whom I have the greatest respect, really great respect, is Simone Weil, who is one of the Auschwitz survivors and a very important one. And in her short autobiography, she takes 3.5 pages to denounce the film, out of perhaps 100 pages. Well, rather surprising after more than 40 years. So why do I bring it up? Because it's one of the things that came. So?
How many pages does she spend on Leni Riefenstahl?
Interesting question. None at all. Not at all. Well, I mean, it's another subject matter. It's because she feels that the film created a counter myth to the Gaullist myth. That the film seems to show or imply that the French were inactive or cowardly or whatever. I can't interpret her on this always, but she's not the only one. A whole book has been written against the film called Le Chagrin et le Venin, which means the sorrow and the poison. Written by a fairly good historian, incidentally. I mean, good historian. But just to finish on the Simone Weil story, when it became apparent that she was a very central figure in prohibiting the showing of the film on television, because we were talking about the bottle of wine, at some point I said, well, perhaps if she had been in charge or an assistant on the film, the first thing she would have done is take the wine bottles out of the frame. Long story for a rather short end. But yes, the idea of cleaning up documentaries so they will look more strong. Yes, I do think they have this, also the idea, well, resistance people at the lower part of society are communists and drunks. Perhaps both communists and drunks. All these ideas that swim around this film are strange and bizarre because it cut across something that so many people didn't want to. That myth that so many people had an interest in not exploding or resenting, you know. If you don't like the message, shoot the messenger. The serendipity has very much to do with that. If you don't, but I'm still here, so they didn't shoot me, or they didn't succeed in shooting me. And anyway, that's only a joke. Yes, the casual and the atmosphere. The Graf brothers, actually it's one, they're always together, but Alex does hardly any talking. It's really Louis, the one with it. And he is a fabulous character. And one doesn't know that in advance. His eyes, I noticed that you were amused at the end when there's a sort of a freeze frame. And when it becomes obvious that he does have an answer to that particular, that the other ones don't want, that he just suppresses the answer. He was a great human being. He is indeed, I think, the hero of the film. I think that Louis is just another small anecdote. When the film finally was put on television and seen by, I think, 4 million people, which at the time was huge.
Just in France?
Wow. Yes, in France. It's been seen in many other countries, in BBC and all. But when it was finally shown, some journalists the day after went down and tried to find the witnesses and interview them. And somebody did show up at the graves. And so Louis was asked, did you see the film? And his answer was, if you think we've got the time to look at 4-hour films, you're crazy.
Now, something that strikes me is in the early 1970s when this is made, certainly a big part of American documentary filmmaking was for the director to not be in the frame, to be an observer of what was going on. And I presume that... Direct cinema, cinéma vérité. Yeah, exactly. And I presume that some of the aesthetics of this film, where you're sometimes in the frame asking a question, kind of come out of the tradition of television news that this sort of
that's
began.
The answer.
Yeah.
It's I got into this specialty and into this way of trying to tell a story because at the beginning I was asked to do it, and then I kept in that. But yes, indeed. The question is very legitimate indeed. An illustration, there was animosity. My great friend, as you know, Tom, my friend, who is part of the tradition and a very prominent one, is Fred Wiseman. It was never an issue to us because we were friends for other reasons, for personal reasons. But yes, I was told by several people that Richard Leacock felt so strongly an antagonism toward my form of filmmaking that in the mirror where he shaved every morning, he had a photograph of me with the clown's red nose on it. But when we met, we were on good terms. But yes, there was an animosity vis-a-vis toward that kind of.
And do you feel that your presence in your films increased over the years? Yes. I mean, certainly in Hotel Terminus,
much more.
You're very much in there, and I think that I think Michael Moore cites some of those films as an influence on him that gave him a kind of feeling that you could put yourself in. And
you see that, then it must not all be bad. There must be some good side to that, since if Michael says that, yes, I think yes. I don't think I've had any influence, good or bad, on the people who think that they should not get involved. But it raises the whole issue, in fact, about, and again, about journalism. Is there such a thing as objectivity? I don't think there is. And once I think that all approaches, journalistic, film approaches, are the central and determinant thing is le regard, the eye of the beholder. The beholder is very important, and once you have that position, which is mine, basically, then why shouldn't you be in the frame? Then it becomes a matter of, well, perhaps here yes and there no. It no longer is an issue, if it ever was. But yes, it's still around, very much around, the idea that you have a sort of anonymous window on reality that gives the camera that you work with and the frame that you work with prestige and the status that no camera in the world deserves.
Now, you don't believe in objectivity, but I do think a hallmark of your films is making an effort of talking to both sides. So there's lots of times when we think of point of view filmmaking, we think, oh well, here's someone with a point of view and they're only talking to the people that agree with them.
That's one danger, yes.
And well, I mean, maybe as I lead into this conversation, I should cue up the next clip, which is a clip from Memory of Justice. Now, probably, has anyone in this room seen Memory of Justice? You probably maybe got to go see it. Did you see it yesterday, or yeah?
No, I saw it in Bologna.
You saw it in Bologna. Okay, well.
Yes, in Bologna.
Okay, very good. So there's a couple, but understand
this gentleman resents me for not having been in Bologna. No, he really does. No, let me point this out. I'm 87 going on 88, and this was in the middle of a terrific heat wave. And we even had a conversation where he said to me, you could have used the arcades. In Bologna is a beautiful city, which indeed it is. They have those arcades. I could have walked in the shade. I didn't go to Bologna, sir, because I'm not in the habit of following this or any other film everywhere where it's being shown. But yes, I was invited, I had accepted, and I
couldn't make it. But you're here at the School of Visual Arts.
Squeezed out because of the heat.
So, Memory of Justice has, thanks to Martin Scorsese's Film Foundation, is Margaret here still? Yeah. Oh, there she is. Margaret Bodie, I have to acknowledge.
Indeed, yes.
Superhuman work at helping to restore this film along with the Academy.
The Film Foundation. And thank God for the Film Foundation, and thank God also for Martin Scorsese, who is the great filmmaker, film fan, the greatest film fan and filmmaker you could possibly imagine in the world.
So the restoration has only been scantily screened. It was at the Berlin Film Festival, the Bologna Film Festival, Toronto Film Festival, yesterday at the New York Film Festival. And
under the arcades in Bologna.
And soon we hope will become available in circulation in universities and other educational institutions in a way that's still being worked out. But so Memory of Justice took its inspiration from a book by Telford Taylor, who was a prosecutor at Nuremberg, an American prosecutor at Nuremberg, and in the 1970s, during the Vietnam War, Telford Taylor was asking himself the question, and asked himself the question in a book called Nuremberg and Vietnam, that if we believe in the
American tragedy.
An American tragedy.
Don't understand, the subtitle is important, an American tragedy, because the question does come, if you have du recul, if you given it wasn't just a tragedy for the Americans, was it? It was also a tragedy for the Vietnamese. Well, anyway, okay. So yes, Telford Taylor, terrific guy.
And so Taylor was asking the question, if we believe in the principles of justice at Nuremberg, what does that mean for America in Vietnam? So taking that as a seed of inspiration, you set off making Memory of Justice, and I would, the themes that we've woven through this film is first examining what happened at Nuremberg, at the Nuremberg trials after World War II. How was a process of justice arrived at to judge the war criminals of the Nazi regime? And then other layers, contemporary in the 1970s when the film was made, looking at the conversations taking place over Vietnam War resistors and how America was going to come to grips with its involvement in Vietnam, also how France should come to grips with its involvement in Algeria. So the clip I pulled to show now, we talked before about Marcel's range of interviewing people from the lower echelons of society to the upper echelons. Here we see Marcel talking to people from who once occupied the highest power in Nazi Germany, where he interviews Albert Speer and Karl Dönitz, the Nazi architect Speer and naval commander. And
Minister of Armaments.
Speer. Yeah.
Speer was Minister of Armaments, who was one of those most powerful. And Hitler had thought of him as his successor. At the end, they didn't get along anymore for reasons that we won't go into. But anyway, yes, so Speer was extremely very high up in the Nazi hierarchy.
So let's watch that 3-minute clip of these interviews from Memory of Justice.
All right.
I want to ask you, your family had to flee the Nazis from Germany and France and over the Pyrenees and to America. And now here you are with the opportunity to confront two of the biggest surviving Nazis. How do you prepare yourself for that kind of interview?
By reading, doing research, reading. Well, it seemed once I had reached, and this was before even reading Nuremberg in Vietnam and Telford Taylor, once I thought the original idea came because I thought, after all, okay, there's all this controversy about the saw and the pity, but after all, National Socialism didn't originate in France. France was invaded, and perhaps I should look, yes, in my own background, but principally the idea that, and then by and by it came the idea that Nuremberg would be the right framework for doing it, looking into the German past and how National Socialism happened, then the Nuremberg trials, and then the consequences of the Nuremberg trials, the principle of Nuremberg, which obviously brought us to Algeria and Vietnam. But Speer, once that framework was decided upon, it almost goes without saying that the survivor of the defendants should appear in the film. Actually, there were 3 survivors.
In that most of the Nazis who were tried at Nuremberg were sentenced to death and
yes,
hung.
A great many of them were hanged and therefore were unavailable.
And so the three that were possible.
Yes, there was a third one who was the head of the head of the Nazi youth Hitler Youth, who was half American and who asked to be paid quite a considerable sum. He wasn't the most interesting one anyway, but he wanted $10,000, so we didn't do it. Okay, but yes, Dönitz, whatever my own feelings about it were, once you do a film about Nuremberg and Speer is still around to be interviewed, it's quite voluntarily that at the beginning I asked him, how many have you? Because he was available to everyone, journalists and cameras, and when he came out of his 20 years in Spandau. Now, why that was so, well, there are many various theories on that. But your question was how, considering that I have a Jewish background, that is the question.
And not, not even the specifics of that, but I'm just thinking about,
well, it is pretty specific.
Well, sure.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking about preparing for any kind of intimidating interview.
Oh, I hardly ever want to intimidate, no. I think wanting to intimidate people is, if you're in that kind of business, is counterproductive.
I actually meant they might be intimidating to you.
Oh, intimidating to me. I see. Well, that could have been the case with Speer, except that, as it says toward the end of the film, but you haven't seen the film, so we can't talk about it very long. He was personally extremely charming, and we talked on the telephone before, and there was really nothing intimidating about him that way, except of course in the larger sense that how do you feel facing such a very major war criminal?
In fact, I think that part of the intimidating aspect of it is here you have an opportunity as a, as a journalist, as a historian, and you kind of don't want to blow that opportunity. You want to make sure that you're asking a question, and that and then if he weasels out of that question, you have a strategy for.
And it turned out that all of that was unnecessary. Whatever the strategy might have been, it was unnecessary because he was so fantastically cooperative. He offered to show me and the camera his home movies, for instance.
Which we see in the film, which you have seen in the film.
That are in the film. And yes, it became probably, I would say, one of the 2 or 3 best interviews I've had the privilege to make. It still doesn't answer your basic question, which is indeed about how can I face such a man? That's the question. And I don't have an answer for it. It just seemed to me to be part of my job. And I was not prepared in no way, in spite of the knowledge I had of his part in all these things, I was not prepared to meet a man so forthcoming.
Now, Dönitz is a little different. Dönitz is not the suave, jokey person that Albert Speer was.
Jokey is a little bit, he wasn't really jokey. Anyway,
he has some wit to him.
Yeah.
Jokey.
No, Dönitz, yes. Well, in the film, Telford Taylor, who was the prosecutor in Nuremberg, answers the question about Speer. He says the reason he was not hanged, while people less guilty than he, doesn't say it in quite that way, were hanged. I mean, people, ideologues who were not bodily, not physically involved in the commitment of the crime. He says the reason is because he was such a cultured man and charming, and that this obviously influenced the judges. So when I went to Germany, I told Speer, I then cut that part of it out, of course, I just confronted him with what Taylor had said. And there indeed, there's this very humorous, not really, this reaction, well, if that's what I owe my life to, then I'm grateful. That's what he says at the end of his involvement in the film. But Dönitz, yes.
Dönitz is much more defensive and
yes.
trying to
and
move off the point.
He has a much more difficult thing, because he did make a terrifically anti-Semitic speech, which was part of the Nuremberg trials. And I do confront him with that, and he has no answer. He's stuck with it. If it hadn't, that this could not have been, if it hadn't been for the poisonous of the Jewish race, but the thing, because you were talking earlier, Tom, about tactics, and I have to confess, I did it more or less on purpose to show up late for that interview, so that he would indeed be. And at the end of the interview, again, what happens off camera is often rather interesting. He was all like that. You could see it in the film all the time during the interview. And at the end, when I said, okay, thank you very much, he stood up and he said, was I good? Human frailty. Was I good? Depends for what purpose. For the film, he was good.
Let's watch another clip from Memory of Justice. This is the opening to the second part of Memory of Justice. If you watch it in a movie theater, you've been through 2 hours of some pretty heavy stuff, and you've gone for maybe a 15-minute intermission. You've come back, and we'll watch the first 3 minutes of how the second part opens. And one of the things that I want to ask you about in this is your use of music, because it's I think a hallmark of your filmmaking to help leaven some of the very heavy stuff.
It has to do. Let me say this before you show the clip. It has to do with show business. I'm the son of a very great director, as we said in there. I think is one of the great directors of the 20th century. And my mother was an actress, and my whole approach to Germany has very much to do with that background. Perhaps more than Jewish or not, very much to do with it. And as a matter of fact, in the second part, there's a whole section on Fritz Kortner, who was a bit my spiritual uncle, was 10 years older than my father, that great German actor. That great actor, that great Polish actor, reminds me of To Be or Not to Be, but that really great German actor. And after this, there is indeed the whole business of, well, what about denazification and what were the criteria for denazification, and what were the criteria for denazification specifically in show business. So that is also the reason why it opens on that particular thing. Okay.
All right, so we'll watch this little bit from Memory of Justice. So I mean, that's one example, and there are others in Memory of Justice and your other films. There's a clip of a Fred Astaire song at one point in Memory of Justice, and you know, as you watch this 4.5-hour film, they seem to arrive very strategically at moments where you could use a little pause, a little mental break to take in all these layers of history and concepts of justice that the film is taking on. I wanted to ask about your approach to using music in that way.
I think you gave one of the main reasons, which is that I think that between you have to give on such lengthy films while the spectator is watching time not so much to relax, but time to digest things as they happen in the film, and to think about it. And it's also a way of tying in one, and also again we come to this issue of a certain form of puritanism in documentary filmmaking, which was not part of my temperament. I like to use all the weapons at the disposal. All that seems to can be disposed in order to attract the public and keep it attracted. Attracting the public is not so terribly difficult if you have some good advertising. And getting people into a theater seems to me not so terribly difficult. It's keeping them there that is, and obviously with this kind of length, absolutely. And there are all the threads, all the strings that you can use on a violin. Why not try to use them?
You know, it strikes me that for most of your career, the lengths of your films have been real standouts. There are, you know, very few other documentary filmmakers that we can think of that make films longer than 2 hours long. Frederick Wiseman is one who's made some longer films.
My favorite film of his, but I don't think there's any link. My favorite film of his, I think, is 9 hours long. It's called Near Death. It's about decision making in hospital about when you should turn the valve off. 9 hours of it. Oh, excuse me for interrupting. Yes.
No. Well,
no.
you know,
I think I'm the pioneer in this matter of filmmaking. But as I tried to explain, perhaps in a defensive way, because I don't really feel terribly guilty about it. It just happened because of circumstance.
Well, and in a way, not that you're part of this now or need to be, but I think that contemporary filmmaking has finally kind of come round to this because the current methods of digital distribution, like a Netflix, or,
yes.
have opened up the way for more episodic filmmaking. This year, earlier this year, there was this series called The Jinx, which is a murder mystery investigation that ran 6 hours on HBO. And
yes.
so I think that at long last, that's actually becoming contemporary?
Yes. Well, before that, I don't know so much about the American scene anymore because I don't live here, and it's difficult to follow such progressions or changes in tendency from on the other side of the Atlantic. And otherwise, I live far from Paris, and I'm out of a lot of things, but not just that. But before, well, there's been Shaw.
Absolutely.
And,
Claude Lanzmann's 9 Hour
and
Show.
one film about same subject matter. I don't know how it was called here. I don't even know if it was shown here. Called Apocalypse, not Apocalypse Now, but Apocalypse, about the Second World War, with nothing but archival footage, and which I thought was a very good film. 3 or 4 evenings in a row. Yes, sure. It was very unusual at the time, and only unusual because had it been shown as it was originally intended in 2 evenings, let's come back to that. Had it been shown in 2 evenings, there's nothing extraordinary about asking a TV audiences to watch 2 hours of a documentary and then perhaps come back for the second evening because they were interested and thought it was good, and they look at 4 hours. Not such a big, it wasn't such a big deal. It's only when it was stopped from being shown on French television that the BBC made this decision of showing it in 1 evening, and it then had this apparently pioneering aura.
And I mean, I wonder, being a pioneer in this kind of long format, if you have any reflection on what to do with a long format, or what the strengths of that long format are that you couldn't have achieved making shorter films.
To me, the essential thing is the development. When do people in front of a camera stop being conveyors of statements and become people? To give people enough air around them, elbow room around them, so that the public can get a sense of who they are, seems to me essential. There are also minor things which are more a little bit like jokes. I mean, a person who used to be that way, it isn't so much anymore. If you have actors who speak their lines, it comes faster because they've learned the lines, and while with real people, the hesitations are sometimes more important than what they say. The hesitations they have, at what point, and to let this breathe. So if the film is supposed to breathe, the people in front have to breathe, and you have to give them time to breathe. Gee, I expressed that rather well, I think.
Well, it's also a good setup to the final clip that I had pulled, which is from Hotel Terminus. And this is about the first half of Hotel Terminus. And you're talking to, is his name Robert Taylor?
Yes, Robert Taylor, so not to be confused with Telford Taylor.
Right.
Yeah, Telford Taylor is in one, Robert Taylor is in the other. There are a lot of Taylors in the world. This one.
Tell us who Robert Taylor was.
Yeah, no, there's a whole string in Terminus of spies and counter spies who covered what is called the rat line. That is all the elaborate system that was put up by the CIA and the people around the CIA to get Nazi criminals out of Europe and into South America, and was called the Rat Line. And there are some of them, since this is, the terminus is about Klaus Barbie and his career.
Actually, I should take a step back for people who don't know the film. Yeah. Hotel Terminus, The Life and Times of Klaus Barbie. Barbie was a Nazi who was in France.
In Lyon, yes.
And
known as the Butcher of Lyon.
And around the time that you were making the film in the 1980s, he, after many years of being in hiding, or living in secret, he had been...
Pseudo-hiding, because a lot of the French, for instance, knew exactly where he was. They just thought it was a bit of a hot potato to really get hold of him. And when the socialists came in, thanks to Robert Badinter, whose parents were deported by Barbie, the decision was made to bring him back to France. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
That's a good filling in. And so you embarked on this film because Barbie had been caught, and so this was an opportunity to investigate his history. Also, there's a kind of meditation in this about bringing someone to justice some 40 years after crimes have been committed, finding the trail of justice there. And as you've alluded to here, a part of that story that I think was surprising to many Americans to hear in the 1980s is that
how involved the American Secret Service was in all that.
In actually helping Nazis
escape, including to the United States.
And one of the motivations was that they felt that if we don't help these Nazis, the Nazis will get in the hands of the Soviets.
People, they'll be able to talk. That was, yes, indeed.
It's part of the Cold War.
Yes, part of the Cold War. They weren't supposed to talk to the enemy, so better get them out and put them away where they are shielded. And so the most prominent of all of that, of course, was Eichmann. Yeah. Eichmann was in Argentina, and Barbie was in Bolivia, and they all had corresponded with each other, and it was all a tremendous cover-up. And getting back to Robert Taylor, but I think that comes out in the interview, I'm not sure.
Well, before we say that, I'll just say that around the time that you were making your film, there were other reporters who had been uncovering information about this chapter of history, about the rat line that helped American collusion.
Naturally, yes.
And you were, in fact, you feature some of those reporters in the film. You interview them, giving them their due credit for.
Well, that seems logical. But this is a man who actually said that, recommended this man to recommended Barbie to his superiors. I'd sort of forgotten about it, so it took me a minute to why he's in the theater at all. He recommended him, this Barbie, to his superior officers by saying, that was in Germany, that was before the Rat Line, by saying that Barbie was a Nazi idealist. So the interview is around this concept, what the hell is a Nazi idealist,
Well, let's look at this clip of the interview with Robert Taylor in Hotel Terminus. I mean, I think that interview is a good example of what you were saying before about letting something breathe. That interview clip lasts about 3 minutes long. Frequently in documentary films now, we'll be cutting every 30 seconds.
Yes, Tom. And it's funny because, well, not really funny. I thought that I should explain which actually needs no explanation because it's on the screen and I've forgotten about it. I don't spend all that much of my time seeing my own films I made 30 years ago. One of the reasons I don't is because they're very long. At such a time,
like
you can perhaps see 2 or 3 other films. But yes, the thing that stuck to me, and I didn't know whether this would come in the film clip, but it's there. I mean, the explanation of why the interview is right there at the beginning. Incidentally, there again, I'm not the only one who's asking questions. There's Christopher Simpson, who was the American, who was my researcher in America and the United States, who brought many of the people that we were looking for. But the thing that sticks to my mind and stuck to my mind, and perhaps this is characteristic of my frivolity or lack of seriousness, is how unhappy he is that his wife answers the question and takes over the whole thing. That seems to be what makes it really interesting. That he would have made that thing and made that recommendation and talked about Nazi ideology, Nazi idealists. Well, yes, what makes it come alive is the relationship the two have to each other. And that seems to be the important part of it. Yes, indeed.
So, you know, we have a half hour left in this session, and I would like to open it up for other questions. If anyone has one, you can raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and we can keep this going. And until someone does raise their hand, I will continue asking. Yeah, Deborah. I'll just repeat that question for other future people that have questions. We have a microphone that we'll bring to you. But the question was, when Sorrow and the Pity finally was broadcast in France, how was it received?
Well, but there had been before, because of the fact that it was not shown and because the government said not wanted to show it, there had been a great deal of talk and writing about it, and so that it was not all that surprising that when it did come on television, a lot of people felt like seeing it because it had become a national issue.
Did the government even have a reason to be worried about showing it? I mean, you know.
Do I feel that they had reason to be worried about showing it?
Or was the reaction at the time that it was finally shown such that anyone caught any guff for?
I'm sorry, that I think
the fact when it was finally shown, you know, was there any kind of?
There were still negative reviews. Yes, there was still.
And was there any controversy for the? Was there any controversy for the government?
It never stopped being controversial, but it had become part of the whole national discussion about the past of. Which was perhaps the controversy, and you asked me whether I understood did you ask me that? Whether, yes, at the beginning, it was against the interests of great many political persons and even historians. It went against the grain. It went against the national grain. But as I believe I said before, if the time had come, and if we hadn't made it very soon, rather sooner than later, somebody else would have, I think.
Let me ask you about being at the heart of a controversy, because it's not that easy a thing to read articles assailing your film or assailing you personally, or
Including assailing me personally,
Yeah.
yes.
And I want, and you know, and you haven't exactly shied away from controversy throughout your career. What is your attitude towards being at the center of controversy?
Trying to be able to take a vacation from it once in a while. Yes, sometimes it gets a bit heavy, but on the other hand, it's also stimulating. It makes the blood, what's the term? Not the blood flow. The blood flows anyway. But what's the
That
term?
is the term, the blood flow. Even though the blood flow faster.
The adrenaline.
Adrenaline.
The adrenaline. And that's not a bad thing to have the adrenaline picking you up and carrying you from one place to another.
So, I mean, do you feel like you've needed enemies, or?
That is a very good question, but it gets you into a session of psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis only takes 50 minutes, you know.
Okay. Does anyone have a non-psychoanalytic question?
No, no. I'm not warding you off. I'm just saying, do I need enemies to make me happy? That's the question. Not initially. I didn't, again, I have to point out, the serendipity was an assignment. So I wasn't looking for enemies when I made the serendipity. It just seemed to me that on the basis of what we knew at the time, those were the facts that should be presented in a film. So, still, your question is not unjustified. Again, I don't necessarily have an easy answer to it. Perhaps at the start, not only didn't I need enemies, I probably didn't want enemies. But then over the years, perhaps I got used to enemies, and at some point it became important for me to have them. It's one somewhat psychoanalytical answer to your very simple question. Enemies. Yes. One of the things is about getting to be that old is that so many people I knew have died, and sometimes I have the feelings, well, all the friends are gone. The only thing that's left are a few enemies.
Who do you feel closer to?
François Truffaut.
Go ahead. We could bring a microphone to this gentleman here.
I just wanted to ask about something completely different, and that is your attitude towards post-production and editing.
The question was about your editing process. I mean, you know.
Oh, about the editing process.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't script in advance. That's one of my difficulties. It's one of the reasons I made enemies, since we're talking about them. I don't script in advance. I find that the idea, well, we were talking about how the hell could I know that Spare would want to show us his home movies? Was I supposed to write in advance and then Spare will show us his own movies and write a script in advance? Even if I wanted to, I couldn't do it. I don't know what is going on. And also to me, everything that is worthwhile in documentaries, seems worthwhile to me, has to do with spontaneity. So not only do I not know what people are going to say in advance, I don't really want to know. I want to be surprised and then try to convey that surprise and that moment of life to an audience. That means, so that's just a preliminary. I don't have a script. So when I come into the editing room, I write, if it's called writing, I structure. Everything happens in the editing room, so that finally this whole business about interview and how doing it, my attitude is really basically a rather passive one during filming. I try to film very fast, same thing with Martin, incidentally. Film fast and then take all the time you need, and again making enemies, because that time producers don't actually feel or think that I should be entitled to all that much time. So again, conflict. But letting things come together in the editing room, getting ideas that one person said this, yes, I remember, the other person said that, let's try to put them together. Let's try to cut from this person to that person because of that. And through that process, a dramatic structure, sooner or later, takes place. Yeah, the editing to me is everything. It's the very center of creativity.
Hi, thank you for being here. I just had a question regarding editing. Again, you were just saying that editing is everything to you, that you really enjoy editing, the process of editing, and you were saying you like to film fast. So when you're going through the hours and hours of footage, at what point, when you're at the 2-hour mark, do you say, okay, I'm done with this 2 hours? Or what is the structuring?
There are ways of indexing. I don't work alone in the editing room, and there are themes that are indexed so that I know a little bit what connects with what. Yes, that's part of it.
And so for you, the editing process is the most creative process of producing a film?
Is the editing process the most creative process?
Yes, to me it's the only creative part of it. The other thing is just gathering, you know, bee goes from one flower to the other, but the honey isn't made while the bee is flying. The honey is made afterwards. Well, it's a silly.
One of the things I experience when I'm watching your films is I feel like the film is always one step or two steps ahead of me in delivering new characters, in delivering new layers of history. And one of the things I find thrilling about your films is the experience of trying to catch up to how much smarter the film is than I am. Whereas in
that should put you definitely off.
Well, I mean, I think it's a welcome contrast to so many films where
well, you know in advance
something is being spoon-fed to you.
Well, thank you. Then it is a compliment.
But I wonder how much you think about when you're making films that have complicated history to them. You know, each character has their own history, and sometimes you.
It's a very interesting issue, Tom, because I don't think whatever genre the film belongs to, that it should leave the spectator behind and underinformed. I think it is indeed important that when you get new aspects that the film should provide enough so you may be surprised so that you may be surprised at getting something at any particular moment because you didn't expect it. But you shouldn't be surprised in the way that you are underinformed. And indeed, that is an issue in editing, yes. And again, we come to the basic thing with Hitchcock. It's better for the public to have an advance than if the protagonist is walking toward danger and death, it's important for the audience to know it rather than to be surprised by it. It's a basic Hitchcock principle. And it should apply to my films. And indeed, if it doesn't, or wherever it doesn't, that would be a mistake, a failure. People should be able to keep up with whatever the film provides as it goes.
I think in a scene like the Robert Taylor interview that we saw, you know, when I watched that, there's a credit says he was a member of the CIC, and I think, what the hell is the CIC? I don't, you know, it's not the CIA. You know, what is that? But in a way, it doesn't matter because you're getting enough from that interview, both an emotional content and a historical content.
And he's not the only one. There are, I think, 4. No, I think that you're being a bit unfair because it is explained as you go along what is the CIC, which was a forerunner of the CIA.
I didn't mean it as a critique. I didn't mean it as a critique.
Well, you're perfectly entitled to state critiques, and we talk about them. I mean, it's one of the reasons for our having a conversation. I think it's perfectly fine. I think that in the film, if you see it, the information for that particular aspect of it is provided in due time. But that criticism might still be very valid in other places and in other contexts.
Well,
it's an important issue.
I think
a very important issue.
What I enjoy about these films is when I walk out of them, it gives me an appetite to go read another book or delve into that history further, as opposed to a film that ends and you feel and it's wrapped too neatly with a bow.
And the hope that when we find ourselves in a dialogue, all the microphones will work.
Speaking of
Not
microphones,
only not getting paid, but not having the mic work is a problem.
Here's a question right here.
Perhaps this isn't a fair question. But
Sorry?
I said perhaps this is not a fair question, but having just seen this incredibly layered, artistic, creative things that you've done, I have never seen Memory of Justice, but that scene with his wife.
Because it's not been, if it weren't for the fact that it's been restored, and I hope you will have now the occasion of seeing it, but you couldn't have seen it. Okay, excuse me for interrupting.
Well, I just wanted to ask you whether you think there have been any good narrative films made about this same subject and same period.
Yes.
Would
Yes.
you mention them?
Nazi crimes in general, yes. My own personal favorite, and I won't give you a whole list, but my own personal favorite is Polanski's The Pianist, which is a film on the subject of Nazi crimes.
And collaboration.
But there are others, Schindler's List, there are quite a few. As a matter of fact, there are so many that once in a while one is entitled to think, well, when will it be settled? When will it stop?
But
It's not a totally invalid question because it keeps being over and over and over again in different contexts. But yes, I think The Pianist is a masterpiece. It's an example.
And were you wondering about the subject of collaboration in particular?
Oh, collaboration. You're talking about the serendipity. Well, it's not the same thing. Yes, there have been films about that too. Some of which I enjoy, some of which I enjoy less. Mostly French films, as you would expect. La Lucien, for instance. Louis Malle. But as a matter of fact, since I picked La Lucien, which is a very ambiguous film because it sets up the theory that one could be a torturer, a Nazi torturer, and at the same time be in love with a Jewish girl, and I remember Louis Malle, whom I knew, and we rather liked each other. But at one time when I was working in America and La Lucien came out, he had said he could never have made La Lucien without the song The Pity. And my reaction at the time was very antagonistic, and he knew about it because he read about it. I said, well, if perhaps in that case, I better should not have made the film because I disliked it that much. So it all has to do with subjective criteria, which are difficult to explain, sometimes impossible to explain.
In your films, there is a lot of engagement between history and contemporary times. In that, you know, the history you're looking at, you're making relevant, and indeed is very relevant to what's happening in contemporary times. And I wonder how conscious you are of that as a device in your films.
I became conscious of that from, again, we always come to that same point. A reportage, whether it's 10 minutes or 20 minutes or even a little longer, does not need structuring, a storyteller, some way of telling the story, structure. And it is when I gradually came from making reportage, where I think I learned a lot, to that the idea became more and more present that you're not, if your subject is contemporary history, it should somehow look beyond the present moment. That the present moment can be used, but in a larger context. And yes, I think that's the case with most of my films, from the serendipity on. And was I conscious of that, was the question. I think rather early on, yes. It came together with the need of structuring, the idea, once you structure, you want to be able to do it on a basis of the thing not being a daily occurrence, so it being perhaps the film about the Berlin Wall the Berlin Wall was a contemporary event.
Your film November Days,
yes.
which is you made after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
I was asked to make a film by the BBC about the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the principal problem in that film was that the wall had already fallen. Once the wall, so it was a matter of finding people, but I won't go into the details of that. The reason I think about it is that the co-producer, the German co-producer of the film, thought that it was a reportage. But if it had just been a reportage, how could it have been shown on the 5th anniversary, on the 10th anniversary, on the 15th anniversary, on the 20th anniversary? There must have been something in the damn thing that still captured attention.
You know, and even as we're talking about this, I think of how many films today feel either they fit into a box of this is a history film or this is a film about a contemporary issue, and I think your films stand out by overlapping the two, by interweaving the two.
Yes, I guess that's the intention. That was also a very good question on bringing up that issue, Tom. What's the difference between a journalist and a historian? It's in the term itself. Jour is the French word for day. A journalist is a person who reports about on a daily basis. And a historian is basically the same thing, except that it's over a longer lapse of time. But it's always the same thing. Try to know what it's all about, do the necessary research, and then come up with the goodies. It seems to me that the idea that historians are somehow more entitled to status than journalists. Well, for one thing, historians couldn't work and do their work if there hadn't been journalists before who had done their work. So at some point, one job, one task, one assignment melts into the other. And this happened, I suppose, in my films. Without my necessarily thinking all of these things through. It's with hindsight that we can talk about it, because
we'll give time for one more question. This is your opportunity, not available to the people of Bologna, to ask Marcel Ophuls a question, right here.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on your, I think you said that you were antagonistic at first towards Le Comme Lucien.
That you were antagonistic at first to Lucien.
Le Comme Lucien?
Le Comme Lucien, Louis Malsom.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, is it because he, at least in my opinion, seemed to make the young Vichy policeman almost innocent and ignorant of his actions?
Was it because he made the Vichy policeman seem almost ignorant of and innocent of his actions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I think it is a rather ambiguous and nasty film. I think it's also gave, as did other films at that time, a sort of an alibi to people who had not done anything. But on the other hand, my attitude toward these things, the danger is, and I don't really want that. I don't want to see myself in that light. I'm not a prosecutor. I'm not a judge. I don't want to be one. But I react, as you say, antagonism, when I have the feeling that such and such, that's why it came up, such and such a movie is kissing the public's ass. That I resent in that particular, on those particular issues.
Let me,
As a matter of fact, I don't like it on the other issues either.
let me ask a final question. We just have 2 minutes, and then we got to clear the room for the next class. But
Yes.
Ambiguity is at the center of your films. Your films don't really seem to be a search for black and white. They're an exploration of the gray. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Absolutely. I think that life is ambiguous, and trying to find a shortcut through those ambiguity by adopting one ideology or another is being unfair to yourself and unfair to others also. Ideological approaches are poisonous, and they have been in the 20th century, and I'm afraid they will be again. Ideology is always some sort of way of shielding oneself from the complexities of life. And so reminds me of what my favorite film before the war, my favorite American film. My father was the one, even in Paris before the war, who said, oh, you should go see such and such a film. And there's a film by one of my great idols, Frank Capra, called You Can't Take It With You. And there's a place where Lionel Barrymore, who's more or less the chief, says, communism, fascism, voodooism, everyone looks for an ism these days. Well, looking for an ism, I think, is not a good idea.
cel Ophuls, thank you very much for taking the time with us.
If we talk about that, actually, thanks to François Truffaut and the friendship of François Truffaut, the first thing I did was a sketch, the German sketch as it happened, to a film called Love at 20. That wasn't bad. It was okay, I think. The best sketch was his, not the other 3 or 4. Antoine and Colette is wonderful. But then I got the opportunity to make a film with, again, through the friendship with Truffaut, I got to know Jean Moreau, and we did a comedy that was successful, was not so much, I'm not a member of the New Wave, I never was. For one thing, I'm already too old for that. I was already a bit old to be a member of the New Wave. But it wasn't so much a director's film, it was actors. It was a comedy, actors. And it was successful. And after that, we had the plan of doing another Belmondo Moreau film, and they were off. Jean was off filming with Orson Welles, and I went, and we got there weren't enough again, it was a matter of groceries, as it so often is. And so I took on a film that where the director was sick, and I took it on, and it was a film with Eddie Constantine that I did and that was indeed a very bad film. And
it
so I
kind of
didn't find any
sort of
work.
closed doors for you in fiction, and so
I went
created
into
a
not really right away in documentaries, but into journalism on French television. And out of the 3 years of work, was about 3 years, I learned, or I hope I learned, about journalism. So when the time came when that crew working in television was offered the opportunity of doing contemporary history programs, I was the one who was assigned to do them. And so it was first before the Serendipity. They were 2 evenings. You know, there's a lot of talk, why are the films long and so forth. Well, because the original commission was not for a long film in one evening, it was separate evenings. And the first one was about the Munich Agreement, 1938. And that was successful. And so we just did the follow-up, which turned out to be the Serendipity. Except that in between time, I don't want to give a lot of autobiography here, but in between time, there had been 1968. And André Harris and Alain de Sédoué, who were my bosses in television, and André Harris is the co-author of the Serendipity because we did the interviews together. Totally unrealistic and no longer believable.
So you made this 4-hour film with German TV money, and then
not only, also
with other,
yeah.
And then when it comes time to try to air it on French television, you hit a roadblock.
Yes, absolutely. And that became a scandal in itself, the fact that French television, who had originally given us the film to make, didn't want to do it. There's perhaps an anecdote in connection with that. By that time, de Gaulle was no longer president of the Fifth Republic. He had just recently retired. And the Director General of French TV went to see him to talk about the film and said to about that they were offered to buy this documentary about the occupation of France. And the general asked him, well, what's in the film? And the Director General said, I wasn't there, but there are witnesses, said some disagreeable truths, mon général. And the general answered, the French don't need truth, they need hope. Which I think is a beautiful, beautiful thing. But let's just say that General de Gaulle and I didn't have the same job. It's a different job.
Yours is the job to tell the truth.
It's not the same job as being a leader in politics.
So, blocked from French TV, you with Francois Truffaut's help, take the film into movie theaters.
Yes. Again, in large part thanks to Francois Truffaut. There was also a board of censors my God, when you think back on it, Gaullist France was full of censorship. I mean, Paths of Glory, Stanley Kubrick's film, was banned from France for some 15 years. But then it wasn't as big a deal for Stanley Kubrick as it was for us being banned. he didn't have all that much at stake. I mean, Paths of Glory is a magnificent film. Anyway, so it had, yes, there's also a censorship board for films at that time. And Truffaut wanted the film to come out, and he appointed two colleagues of his in the Cahiers du Cinéma, one very far left,
It's a real pleasure for me to host Marcel here. He lives most of the year in France, although in his life he's lived in France, Germany, and America, where he went to high school, amongst other things. College, went to Occidental College, right?
Sorry?
You went to Occidental College?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so
not at the same time as President Obama.
Different.
Little early. Little early.
And so in today's, in the 2 hours we have today, I have a few clips that I've pulled from some of Marcel's films as kind of touch points for us to think about some of what makes his films extraordinary to me. And I want to spend some of today putting those films in perspective into the context of the times that they were made. And I also want to spend some time trying to take away some lessons from the several decades of filmmaking that you put in. And along the way, you know, maybe halfway into this, I'll encourage the people in the room to raise their hands and ask questions, and we can, you know, make this more of a dialogue midway through. You know, what brings Marcel here this week is the extraordinary restoration of his film Memory of Justice. So, you know, the films that are probably best known of Marcel's are Sorrow and the Pity from 1971, I think, and then the second really major work after that was Memory of Justice in 1976. There was other work in between, but I think that is a real standout. And then the third one that I think has had the most prominence in the US is Hotel Terminus, which came out in the late 1980s and went on to win an Academy Award. And in some ways, like, those three films can be seen as a kind of trilogy, although I don't think they ever certainly wasn't intentional from the get-go to do that. So let me start with Sorrow and the Pity. Sorrow and the Pity you made after you had made a couple fiction films, following in the footsteps of your father, Max Ophuls. No?
I know.
Already the contrariness arises.
I don't really want to contradict you directly, but the idea of my father's feet were too big for me to even get the idea that I could be in his footsteps.
It was a family profession.
That's why I said no. With feet this big, you can't follow in footsteps this big.
So you had you'd made a couple fiction films in France. The second one, in your own words, was
bad. Well, communist, and another one pretty far right, to the right, so they would shove the obstacles aside. And again, the Emmanuelle Roy, the woman who prepared for that screening.
She was someone who worked with Truffaut. She worked with Truffaut.
Yes.
Yeah.
She was with the Cahiers du Cinéma at the time. And she mixed up the reels on purpose so that the people looking at it would think, well, this is something for intellectual, it can do no harm. And really, and that of course helped them
So it got,
get
got approved to be shown in a French cinema.
Yes, and where it played for 18 months. At first on the left bank in a small theater, and then the other theaters got bigger, and then it played on the Champs-Élysées, and it was extremely successful. But it took another 12 years for the film to be shown on television. And in fact, it was when the socialists, when Mitterrand came to power, they had promised in advance to journalists that the Tsar and the Pity would be shown because it was that big an issue in France. The journalists were constantly asking the heads of state and the people in charge, the prime minister, when are you going to put it on television? And they had promised to put it on television. I happen to know that Mitterrand didn't like the film at all, but there are at least two promises that he kept. One, which seems to me to be the more important one, is the abolition of capital punishment. And the other one is the Tsar and the Pity. Kept at least those two promises. Okay, well, that's the story.
Yeah. So I know in this room there's probably a range of people who have seen some of Marcel's work or haven't. How many people have seen Sorrow and the Pity in the room? And it's not, you're not being judged or counted. Okay. Well, I want to show a clip from Sorrow and the Pity, especially for those of you who haven't seen it. This is a clip from the second half of the film where you are interviewing some former resistance fighters, known as the Grave brothers, Alexis and Louis Grave. And so it's about a 3-minute clip, and Christian, if you want to. So there's a few things that I want to ask about in that clip. One is, you've described to me that one of your pleasures of making documentary films, and I think one thing that you have a special skill at, is being able to interview people from the very top of status and hierarchy to
we were among the strike leaders.
So
against the French monopoly.
For young people in the audience, just to contextualize this is 1968 in Paris. There's student uprisings, they closed the universities.
And among the strikers. As a matter of fact, we must have been prominent strikers since we were the only ones that were fired. So that seems to lead to the conclusion that we must have been rather active. And so then I went to work for German television, and after a while I thought, well, let's just take up that project since we had prepared it and found all the locations and people, and so then.
So Sorrow and the Pity winds up really originating out of German TV.
Yes. Which
even though we think of it as such a French film.
Keep a secret for quite a while because in the French climate of that period, it wouldn't have been a terribly popular thing to admit that we were also mostly financed by German television.
So Sorrow and the Pity, it's being made roughly 25 years after the end of World War II. Yes. And the message that Sorrow and the Pity is delivering in broad strokes is that France during the war was not, everyone was not a resistance fighter. There was a lot of gray area in the world of collaboration. And in fact, even some of the resistance fighters had a complicated experience.
Like François Mitterrand. Who was an example of that. Yes. That were on one side at the beginning and then shifted side as the war shifted side, perhaps. But Tom, if some things are, I think, in in current affairs and in politics and in history occur at a certain time. If we hadn't done it, somebody else would have done it sooner or later, because at that time, the Gaullist communist idea that indeed the whole country had resisted the invader it wasn't tenable anymore. Tenable? Is that a word?
Yeah, tenable.
Tenable anymore. The time had come for that, just as 1968 happened, not by accident. That film, and also the book that Robert Paxson wrote at that time, which we didn't even know because it was simultaneously, La France de Vichy. It had to happen.
These ideas are bubbling
the
up.
Gaullist myths had become